Okay, great. I'll introduce here the last speaker of our special session this morning. Jason Reinhardt is a research associate and quantitative ecologist at the University of Minnesota right here in Minneapolis, where he is working on problems related to invasive species management and imperiled species conservation. Jason, thanks for being here, and help me welcome him.
All right. Jason Tack just talked a bit about conifer removal and kind of the whys of why we're doing it and how effective it is. I'm going to here talk a little bit about the kind of quantification of that conifer removal that's happening across the West. But before I really dig into that, I wanted to mention that in the process of doing this work, looking at conifer removal, we came to realize that woodland expansion or woody plant expansion is a problem that folks are dealing with across the globe in a lot of different systems. It's not something that only we are dealing with in our small corner of the world. So for example, I've got some papers listed up here. In Africa, woody plant encroachment is into grassy ecosystems is altering fire regimes and changing temperature and precipitation patterns. In South America, in Argentina specifically, woodland encroachment into rangeland is having impacts on livestock productivity. And in Australia, some sensitive savanna ecosystems are being constricted by woody plant encroachment and losing ground across the board. And of course, we have a lot of examples of this in North America. So there's a lot of species that quite a few of us are probably familiar with, species like red cedar, creosote bush, mesquite, and more. And a lot of the times this woodland expansion can happen pretty slowly. And because it can often involve native species and kind of the baselines we use to judge change over time shift really gradually, it can make these things kind of hard to notice. And it's only been kind of a little bit more recently that we've developed a lexicon and some new tools to really be able to notice and talk about these changes as they're occurring and kind of think about how to deal with them. And so we can see this sort of decades-long expansion occurring with conifer cover and pinyon juniper cover, especially in the Intermountain West. So in this figure here, you can see this is images from a ranch. The first image on the left is from 1890. You can see there's a few scattered pinyon and juniper woody plants around the property here. But by 1989, about 100 years later, you can see that entire site is just a woodland. And so when these pinyon juniper conifer systems expand, they're often doing it at the expense of sagebrush ecosystems. And so, and as Jason Tack talked about fairly extensively, this has an impact on a number of different sagebrush-associated species, including the sage grouse. So I'm not going to get into it again because Tack just talked about it, but I will mention that on these sagebrush sites, whenever we reach this conifer cover, this pinyon juniper cover of about 4% cover, so Tack's analogy of about 2 checker spots on a checkerboard, we have lek activity just dropping off the board. So there's really been an impetus by a lot of different groups to deal with this problem and problems with other species in terms of conifer encroachment. So there's a lot of different groups out there in the West working on pinyon juniper and conifer removal just range-wide for sage grouse. And to support a lot of these efforts, our group has created a high-resolution conifer map encompassing the sage grouse range. So this is a 1-meter resolution map of conifer cover across the sage grouse range. It shows you where the conifers are, what the conifer cover is at any given point. You can go on the Sage Grouse Initiative website and on the map platform and view this and play around with it. And ultimately, this just provides a synoptic view of conifer cover across the Intermountain West as it stood in 2011, 2013, when we pulled the NAEP data to build this model. And so this data set has proven useful for a lot of different applications, different studies, site selection, prioritization, and planning in general. So we might be able to figure out where the conifers are, and we know that there are a lot of people out there out west working on conifer removal for different reasons. But we still have a problem in terms of tracking these conifer removals. We really don't know where this is occurring and how much of it is occurring. So this is a really broad scale effort. You know, there's a lot of people involved. It encompasses a lot of different states. We're dealing with a huge land area. And the problem comes in that all of these different groups might record data in terms of what they're doing in a different way. Some groups might not even record the location of where they're working, maybe because it's private land or something like that. And for the groups that do record the information in terms of conifer treatment, they might record it in a different way, so it might not all fit together nicely. So ultimately what we're left with is a real lack of any sort of full quantitative assessment of where this type of pinyon juniper management, this conifer management, is occurring across the West. And so we saw an opportunity to kind of sidestep this problem and use a remote sensing and change tracking approach to try and answer these questions of, you know, how much conifer removal is happening on the landscape and where is it happening. So our objectives with this work were to first assess how much conifer reduction is actually occurring on these landscapes. Secondly, figure out where it's occurring and who is doing it. So kind of illustrating the relative distribution of effort of this work. Thirdly, to quantify the relative roles of management, but also fire in terms of this conifer reduction. So it's not just management that's out there reducing the cover of these conifers. We also have wildfires out there burning. And finally, we wanted to identify some future priorities with regard to conifer management. So what did we do? We mapped conifer reduction across the sage-grouse range over the time period from 2011 and 13 to 2015 and 17. And the actual year span varies by state depending on when we had the right imagery available to train these models. And we did this using a random forest modeling approach coupled with land trender temporal segmentation. And so this land trender temporal segmentation helped us to really pick out some of the signals that we were looking for from what otherwise might just be a fairly noisy Landsat time series data set. So if you see this example graph on the right of this temporal segmentation, we might have three different situations on the landscape. So we might have a site, like in this orangish yellow here, that's relatively stable. So you can see that the land trender segmentation kind of draws a stable trend through that site. We might have another site in green here where we see some pinyon juniper expansion or some infill. And so we can see some growth there in terms of the greenness. And we can also see what we're actually looking for in this study, which is that reduction. So if you look at that red line, you can see we start out with fairly high greenness, but then something happens about halfway through the time span of this study, and it drops off. And so that could be a clear cut, as indicated there, or it could be a wildfire or anything else. So we looked at this information, where these reductions were occurring, how big they were, and that sort of thing, across a few different considerations. So we partitioned out these conifer reductions in terms of whether they were attributable to management or whether they were attributable to wildfire. And we did that by categorizing reductions as fire if they fell within a monitoring trends and burn severity fire perimeter. We also looked at conifer reductions across a number of other considerations, so things like states, ownership categories, and whether they fell within or outside of a designated priority area for conservation. So what did we find? We found that there was a total conifer reduction of about 2,200 square kilometers within the sage-grouse range. That comes out to just over 500,000 acres of conifer reduction. And this works out to be about 1.6 of all of the conifer woodlands, pinyon juniper woodlands in the study area as being flagged as reduced. And so depending on how you look at it, this might be a lot or it might not be that much. But in any case, this number may just be barely keeping up with some of the estimates of expansion we can find in the literature, which range anywhere from 0.7 to 1.5% per year. So here's the map of our conifer reduction estimates. On the left, we've got the range-wide map, and here you can see where every individual reduction that we found is plotted on the landscape. So in blue, we've got those conifer reductions that can be attributed to management, and in red, we've got those that can be attributed to wildfire. And the size of the dot represents kind of the size of the overall reduction, kind of, enhanced for scale so you can actually see it. And if we zoom in on a particular area, this area of northwest Utah by Grouse Creek here, you can see how the mapped reductions, the predicted reductions, are showing up on a kind of a smaller landscape scale. So you can see those blue management reductions showing up on some hillsides, and we've got these red wildfire reductions occurring in different areas. And overall, if you look at the donut chart here, we found that about 2/3 of all of the conifer reductions in this study were attributable to management, and just over 1/3 was attributable to wildfire. And this is one of the things that really jumped out at us when we were looking at our results. So fire is really important here. So it has a really substantial impact on the landscape, and it's huge in this conifer reduction. It just plays a huge role. And so not only is it causing just over 1/3 of overall conifer reduction, but it's also causing about 1/3 of all conifer reduction inside of those priority areas for conservation. So fire it has a massive impact no matter how you look at it here. There's also there is some concern in terms of fire. That fires on certain types of soil might carry a little bit higher risk of things like cheatgrass invasion. But we took a look at it, and we found that the fires generally occurred fairly evenly across different ecosystem resistance and resilience classes. So they're not necessarily skewed toward any of those lower resistance and resilience classes or anything like that. But there was some variation across states. So here's an example of a fire-reduced portion of the landscape where you can see a fire kind of removed some conifer from an area in Nevada. So this is a before and after set of pictures from the Cold Springs fire in Nevada in 2015. So if you can make it out, there's this red polygon on these images, and that kind of indicates where the model is predicting conifer loss to show up. And the purple outline that kind of sits outside that is that monitoring trends in burn severity fire perimeter. And so that fire perimeter is what caused us to categorize this area of predicted conifer cover loss as being caused by wildfire. So in general, you can see that the model did a fairly good job of actually identifying where the conifer reductions occurred due to this wildfire. And if you even look at this little inset down here on the right panel, you can see that it was even able to capture some of these little islands that kind of escape the burn of the fire. And so those are showing up as not having any reduction in our results. So if we look at the distribution of effort in terms of conifer reduction across states, we found that about 87% of the reductions occurred in just 3 states, Utah, Oregon, and Nevada. And of these, Utah represented only about 10% of the study area, but had about 1/3 of all the pinyon juniper reduction. And one of the common threads for all 3 of these big states is that they were able to quickly empower a lot of their partners that were interested in doing this sort of conifer reduction work. And they did this by leveraging resources like the Utah Watershed Restoration Initiative, NRCS Strategic Watershed Action Teams, and partnerships with the SGI. And so they really leveraged all the tools that they had available at the time to get going. So when we looked at the results in terms of whether they fell within or outside of packs, we found that just over half of all conifer reductions occurred inside of these priority areas for conservation. So this just kind of tells us that using these packs was really a successful tool in terms of being able to actually successfully target management at a scale large enough to benefit some imperiled species like sage grouse. So lastly, we also looked at these conifer reduction results in terms of how they broke out by ownership. We found that in general, about 58% of the reductions occurred on BLM land, and this is roughly proportional to their total ownership in the study area, which is about 59%. So BLM is doing a lot of work in terms of conifer reduction out west. We also found that relative to the area of ownership in terms of proportion, there was a fairly large amount of reduction occurring on state and local government land. So if you look at this graph on the top right here, the number at the end of the bar graph is the amount of conifer reduction as a proportion of ownership, as a proportion of all of the conifer within that ownership category. So 3% of all of the conifer woodlands on state and local lands experienced reduction, compared to 1.9 and 1.8% on private and BLM lands. But about half of that was due to fire. And overall, just looking at these ownership results, we can see that this kind of really represents a collaborative effort. And if we kind of zoom in on particular areas, we can see that these removal efforts often cross ownership boundaries. So if you look at this map on the bottom right here, there's a couple panels, A and B here, where all of the colored regions represent areas of conifer reduction. And the different colors correspond to different ownership categories. And so you see, especially on panel B here in the middle, that there are some areas of fairly large-scale conifer reduction that go right across ownership boundaries, going from BLM to other federal ownership to private land ownership. So there's really a lot of collaboration going on here, but not necessarily always, as you can see in panel C here, where all of that managed area falls within BLM land, hugging the property boundaries. So one way that we can support broad-scale collaborative efforts like this is by building supportive policy frameworks. And there's a little bit of good news on this front in terms of the 2018 Farm Bill that was just passed. So this bill provides some of this support by codifying the NRCS working lands for wildlife. So this will ensure some future funding to keep some of these projects going. It also provides a little bit of certainty for some of our partners in terms of getting some of this conifer removal going a little bit quicker in some of those states that aren't early adopters through a categorical NEPA exclusion for pinyon juniper management. And so there's really a desire by a lot of different groups to try and replicate the successes of those early adoption states that really got the ball rolling early and removed a lot of conifer. And some of this framework will really help them get going, I think, going forward. So just a quick summary. We used a remote sensing approach to detect conifer reductions across the sage-grouse range. We found that these reduction efforts amounted to about 2,200 square kilometers of conifer reduction, which is just over 500,000 acres. We found that fire was a really big part of this process, just over a third of all reductions. And when we kind of take a look at what's going on the ground, we can see that it does seem to be a fairly cooperative effort. We see a lot of instances of this management crossing ownership boundaries. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.